What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about just random things in Canadian literary history or cultural history or political history, whatever floats our goat in that particular moment. Right?
Whatever boats our goat, man.
Exactly.
Or whatever goats your float, actually.
We are your hosts, two probably depressed English teachers, one of whom really likes a Winnie the Pooh comic right now, and we're going to let the listeners decide which one is which.
Yes to all of it. Oh no, I'm just doing my thing, man. So what are we talking about today, Patrick?
So we're first of all going to thank our Patreon supporters for keeping the show going because they're cool, and we'll remind people that if they want to sign up for anything like Patreon, they could do so for $1, $3 a month, and it's a little bit to help boost the show. But of course, this show will be free and independent always. Now, what are we talking about today? We're talking about 2 books, 2 authors, and a particular moment in Canadian literary history. We're not talking about like a social history in and of itself, like sometimes we make a parallel with a historical moment. It's pure literary history right now. And specifically, the year is 1925, the year when realism came to Canada, right? Because this is the year when, for some reason, all of the books that are considered seminal or integral books for the development of realism in Canada were published at the same time, from Manitoba, mostly. So it's like, what is happening? And I just wanted to talk about that. Will this be a long episode? I have no idea. Probably not.
Will this be an episode? Most certainly.
Look, I would never doubt our ability to talk about the most random of stuff. Yeah.
Listen, we listeners, we literally just ran out an entire Zoom meeting talking about comic books again. So if we can do that, we can do discussions about books.
Oh yeah. So we've
somebody's not paying their Zoom bill now.
Because usually I get it through work, but apparently not now. God damn it. We have to find another alternative. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I obviously want to start the episode by remembering a legend in Canadian literature, right? None other than Alice Munro, right? One of the only, if not the only, Canadian literary figure to have won the Nobel Prize. I don't know if that's still true. One of the only literary figures, if not the only literary figures in Canada. She passed away, obviously, not that long ago, but by the time we recorded this episode, this is when we bring it up. But an absolute loss for the CanLit world. But she lived, obviously, a very successful life and career as a writer. And I personally consider myself someone who really likes her work. I don't know if you.
Canadian literature as it exists today only exists because of what she has done.
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. I think that's really fair. Mm, yeah. So
And then,
rest in peace.
yeah. So she's the only Canadian to have won it for writing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
She's the
Yeah.
only literature. And it was
All
for
right.
her mastery of the short story,
Okay.
which is true. If you have not read an Alice Munro short story,
Absolutely
go
worth
and
it.
do it. Like genuinely, like I am a very jokey person, but her stories are just good. Like even if you can't get the full depths of her writing, it's just worth it to do. Like
Mhm.
oh my
Absolutely.
God. What
It's not
can
like,
you name any of your favorites?
oh, the first one I ever read of hers was Who Do You Think You Are, which is more of like a short story cycle. They're all connected in some way, and it still holds
Mm,
up. It's one of her first ones from the 70s, if not her first one, but really good, really solid. It already demonstrates at a young age how she was capable of constructing um, short stories in very, very tight ways. But
hmm.
I use actually The Bear Came Over the Mountain, which came out later in her career in 2005 or six, which is a story
Yeah.
about Alzheimer's, which is really
Yes,
touching.
it had a film made about it, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah, I forget what the film is called, but it's really good as well. Yeah,
The Bear Came on Mountain is a
about you.
wonderful one.
Yeah,
Um, I did. I ended up reading a lot of them for classes, and I'm blanking on the names of so many of them now. But that
yeah,
just goes to show how incredibly important her work is. There's just so much.
yeah, absolutely. It'll be weird to not have a new Alice Munro collection come out every couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be. I mean, she was the face of CanLit for a while now.
Mhm. Oh
Her,
yeah, internationally
her and
for
Margaret
sure.
Atwood. Her and Margaret Atwood, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. All right.
And unlike
Well,
Margaret Atwood, there was a lot less controversy. Am I wrong?
nope. There you go. What a wonderful send off. You were uncontroversial. All
Honestly, in today's modern day, pop off queen.
right,
Like
let's
you,
get
a
into the
queen
show.
among, like literally a queen among women, the queen of the pen, the queen of the short story,
Absolutely.
the
Okay.
sultan of short stories, even. Or what would be a female version of that?
Oh,
The sultaness of short stories.
sure. Is that really the feminine?
I don't know. Is there even a female sultan?
This is
Sultana.
we're
Sultana.
oh yeah, okay. Like the
The
raisin.
Sultana of short stories. I like that title.
I'm down with that. Yeah. All right. Let's get on with the show. Mac, we've talked about realism on the show before, but for listeners who might not have heard that episode, please explain what realism is as a literary movement and why it matters or doesn't.
So to understand realism, you have to understand what came right before it, which is Romanticism. And Romanticism was basically positioned in the ideal, in the idyllic, the sublime, this idea of like natural beauty, living in nature. Everything was very pretty, lots of talks about roses, which in itself was a pushback against, oh God, what was the scientific movement called again? The Enlightenment period.
Oh, yeah. So, like much
And
of
so
it,
the idea,
yeah, there's a lot of
so
sublime
basically,
imagery.
yeah, we're going into this and like so romanticism was pushing back against like pure science objectivity with beautiful nature symbolism. Everything is beautiful. But as things and all things came to be, we live in a circle. So or a cylinder or whatever you want to call it. So eventually we got to the point where people came back around and at the end of the 19th century, really into the heart of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people were saying, no, everything's awful. There's smog in the air. We're dying of cancer, and the kids are dying in factories. Everything's
We need
shit.
to talk about it.
We have to be realistic about this. Guns are firing. The world's about to go to war. It went to a world war, and people are like, "Hey, we need to have like a real take on this." But unlike the Enlightenment period, it wasn't about scientific objectivity. It was about presenting things in a more complexity, nuanced shades of gray. And that's the point of realism, is to present things as they are perceived, as we can perceive them best,
Exactly.
realistically. And so we get a lot of seminal books from this period because as we all do, we know that critics and award shows really like dark and depressing.
Yeah. And
Having
it's
fun is
also,
for losers.
but also it just so happens, I don't know if it just so happens. It's probably not entirely coincidence, but I don't have an explanation for it beyond just the fact of it existing, is that a lot of novels were, or like the boom of the novel happened during the realism age, right? Like
Yeah.
novels have existed since the 18th century, more or less,
Oh, even
late 17th.
earlier than that.
Yeah, exactly. Like whatever. But it really exploded as a genre
Again,
with
the Industrial
the era of,
Revolution allowed for mass printing. It was the time of the periodical. It was the time of chapters being printed and sold. It was the time of all these different things, which really just
public
allows for
education
larger
was
stories.
public education was allowing people to actually write stuff from their own perspectives, right?
Yeah, Grub Street became a thing,
Mm-hmm. Yep,
and you
absolutely.
just have all these larger, like Victorian era times coming together, which then proceeded to allow the boom of the novel. And it again, to write novels requires things to be happening, and people at that time were living in the one of the most significant times in human civilization. Undoubtedly one of the most significant times, with the boom and the introduction of the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
when science and technology just went absolutely crazy.
Yeah. Like civilization as we know it just went leaps and bounds almost overnight as far as like the grand scheme of history is concerned, right? But it's interesting that you mentioned, right, Enlightenment, Romanticism, Realism, right? I don't want to give the impression, and I understand why you're saying it that way. I don't want to
Yeah,
give
no, this is a very
readers,
large simplification.
oh, for sure. And like, I don't want to give readers the impression that it's that clear cut. Like, as we'll see from some of the novels,
Absolutely.
from the novels that we're going to be talking about today, you do see elements of romanticism still present
Hmm.
in realism, but mostly for things that the author sees in a positive light,
And you
right?
you
Like, I don't
you'll
know if that
see
makes,
elements
yeah.
of realism in romanticism.
Yes. Yes.
Like these things,
Absolutely.
it's don't think of it as like a start and a stopping point, but think of it almost as long arcs happening, and then one arc will start partway through another arc's journey almost. And they will continue like that, you know?
Yep. Absolutely.
Like it's not the
Um,
idea isn't like one stops and then another starts and then stop, start, stop, start. Because we still get realism today. I would argue that as far as film as a genre goes, we're almost in realism for film in a way, with a lot
yeah.
of like the big critical films are in a very realism centric time period right now.
Yeah. I don't know if I would agree, if I would say that realism is that present in novels anymore. In like literature, I think
No.
we've kind of gone past it.
Oh, for sure. Well, literature, because after realism came, realism was modernism, and then modernism became the postmodernism, and now we're in,
Yeah.
I don't I don't freaking know.
Metamodernism, I've heard that one. I'm like,
Postmodernism. We live in the
whatever.
time of the social modernism.
Sure. Right. Whatever. Like we're so fragmented that can you like the literary genres are so fragmented, and can you even say that
Well, we
there is a
also
movement?
exist so much in the past these days with nostalgia and
Yeah.
everything else, that like
Yeah.
all movements are one,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're all just
That's
the movement of
postmodernism.
nostalgia.
It's
Back to Michael
pastiche.
Ondaatje.
Yes. Oh God. It's such a
But
good callback.
so realism as a like as we will be discussing it is basically just a way to take a more
Yep.
complex, nuanced, realistic look at an issue. Where
Hmm.
the novels and poems of old were very grandiose about, say, the topic of war. War is a very common
Yes.
one. They were very
Hmm.
like, war is great, war is good. You are standing for God and country. You're standing for God, king, country. It's awesome. Realism is very, no, things are shit. We're all dying. You're gonna be face down in the mud, and the blood's gonna seep out of you as the light fades from your eyes. Head into the
It's like
wasteland.
fair enough. like for the moment when it emerged with, like you were saying, the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars, no wonder realism kept going as a movement well into the 50s.
Especially World War One before we had the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah.
And
Thanks,
Canada was just causing war crimes left, right, and center. Remember,
But yeah,
it's
like
only a war crime after the first time you do it.
not technically wrong.
You see the
but
video about the cans of food that they did?
the one where they threw it and then eventually replaced it with grenades.
Yeah. So for those who
So
don't know,
good.
back in like World War One, was it?
Yeah.
Canada sent cans of food over to the Germans as a like gesture of good faith, I say in quotation marks. And then the Germans were happy with it and wanted more. So eventually the Canadians sent over cans of food, but instead the cans of food were filled with grenades.
10 out of 10 Canada. Military tactics. A+.
Or there's the
Anyway,
bombing runs. So after the Blitzkrieg bombing runs, when the US bombed the people making the US bombed like the factories, the Brits bombed the people, like the cities, like the urban centers making the factories. Canada bombed the refugee camps.
is that
They
true?
killed,
I didn't
yeah,
know
they
that
killed
one.
over
That's great.
60,000 people in one night.
It's, again, 10 out of 10. Wonderful. For people who
The
can't
logic
tell,
is
this is
if they're
big
alive, they can
sarcasm.
still make bombs, you know?
Big oof. Yeah, not gonna
F's in the
lie.
chat.
That's a
F's in the chat.
Did you see that? I wanted to talk to you about that in the pre-show. Kids are starting to use chat, like not ironically, in their language. Like, oh, chat,
Who?
what do we think of this? As like a fourth
Who?
wall way of thinking for themselves.
Who is this?
Like just kids of like
Oh yeah.
Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is incredible. I think that's such a
Yeah.
funny thing.
That's, I mean, well, it's the way people are, again, very large tangent here, but sort of ties back into realism because it discusses language. The people try and talk about, oh, English language is dying or kids don't know how to talk these days. Like, no, they're just developing their own form of language and speech. You don't know how to talk like
Yeah.
fucking Shakespeare. Okay, boomer, like, come get off your horse.
I'm sorry, but even Shakespeare didn't speak like he wrote because he wrote
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah, like people don't like it's formality's a lie.
Yes,
Formality's a
it's a
lie.
construct.
We listen, it quite literally is. We all spent an entire pandemic pretending to wear pants.
Yeah.
Like
Reality is whatever you want it to be. I'm
formality and
sorry.
reality, and we all just had to pretend we weren't. We all literally had to pretend we were wearing pants for 2 years.
That's okay, but that is a good like an adequate representation of what realism is. You're framing certain things in a particular way to make it look realistic and look real, but there are gaps, right? And sometimes the author is aware of those gaps and sometimes not, right? And of course, after that, in modernism and all of that, we would kind of
Yeah.
emphasize what those gaps are. But yes, that is actually a really good way of thinking about realism. Realism is the Zoom screen that you
Realism as
see.
portrayed by a coronavirus.
Exactly. So, have you heard of either of the two authors that I wanted to discuss today?
Patrick, you ask me this question every episode. The answer never
Sometimes,
changes.
one day, we will get to one that you say yes. You heard of Michael Ondaatje, so
Yeah, that's true.
I have
Anything's
hope.
possible.
Anything is possible.
If it's popsicle, it's possible. I don't think I have. No, I've not heard of these authors.
Yeah, they're one of them is still really popular, I think, in like can lit circles, and that's Frederick Grove, FP Grove, often shortened. The other one, Martha Estenso, and her book Wild Geese. I think you really have to be a nerd, even in can lit circles, to know
Of
that
course, the
one.
straight white male gets all the credit and the prestige.
Look, he was kind of gay, also, but whatever.
Everybody was gay.
Yeah, we could talk
Like,
about it. Honestly, we could do a whole episode on Grove, but that's not the focus of today's episode. But yeah, we could do a whole deep dive on him because he, as a person, is very emblematic of the idea of realism because he just basically fabricated his entire existence.
I love that for him.
might as well talk about him now. Fuck it. Let's start with Grove. Grove, for those of you who don't know, was a guy who was born in Eastern Europe in what today is Poland, right? At the time, it would have been known as Prussia, and basically was not a great guy. He was born under a different name, Felix Paul Grieve, at the time, and he led like what would have been a rather like bougie or bohemian life in Europe for a bit. This would have been in like the late 19th century, early 20th century at this point. And you'll come to know why the dates are a bit fuzzy. Um, but basically, he went around Europe for a bit, trying to be an author, living, some bohemian lifestyle in Italy, France, Berlin, so on. He wrote translations, published poetry, was actually quite controversial for some time for writing some racy stuff. Racy in the 1900s, I guess. But basically, he committed fraud when he was in Europe because he was slowly running out of money, as Bohemians tend to do. And in 1909, what do you do, Mac, when you start running out of money and no one wants to lend you money anymore?
Just die, I guess. Like fall into a pit somewhere, get a disease, get one of the many diseases.
How about all of the above? Basically, he faked his death.
King. Just became the best person ever.
Dude faked his death and basically fled to North America, which in the early 20th century basically meant the other side of the world, like or another planet. He was never to be seen in Europe again. Um, and from that moment on, he completely invented a new identity for himself and settled eventually in Manitoba.
Mhm.
Um, Now, again, a lot of the information about his life is kind of hard to parse out fully because even his so-called autobiography, which is called In Search of Myself, is just fiction. It shouldn't be called an autobiography by any stretch of the imagination. It is.
Mhm.
It has been discovered through excellent archive work that it's pretty much fiction, um, and we can piece moments together from his literary output that he would have been a farmhand for a bit and then a teacher. But he made most of his money from teaching and writing very successful books for some time. Right. So one of them is his 1925, what many consider his opus called Settlers of the Marsh, which we'll get to a little bit later. But yeah,
Let's go.
that's why I say he could be a realist novel in and of himself. Like as a person, he is a perfect encapsulation of realism, where he's like, reality is just me.
Mm.
And it's really interesting to think about. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that idea of like real people being emblematic of realism or a movement, but I think he perfectly captures that
Oh,
just by recreating
100%.
his
Are
life.
you kidding me?
Yeah.
Some people start movements because their life is emblematic of that. Mary Shelley is goth.
Yay!
Mary Shelley
Yes.
is goth. It just
Mhm.
the woman slept in her husband's mausoleum and kept his calcified heart on her desk.
I didn't know that. That's fucking awesome.
Like she is goth, and she started the movement essentially. Like she didn't start it, but she is emblematic
Right,
of that
right.
movement. And I think that's a
Yep.
totally like these things lead into each other, and that's why they become emblematic is because their art and life are related.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Like
can see that.
Mark Twain, I'm only talking about him because that's something I'm doing with
Sure,
some
sure,
of my
sure.
students right now is the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Hmm.
He is emblematic of the antebellum period because he lived it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Huck Finn is in many ways like a lot of his stories and his events.
Yeah. Absolutely. But that's a really interesting perspective because at least from Grove's perspective, he would have grown up and, you know, established himself as an adult and writer as realism was establishing itself. Like
Hmm.
in the late 19th, early 20th century. That's really when it was starting off as a movement with writers like Ibsen and Balzac and so on. And so he would have been present not only in Europe as these movements were developing and would have tried to be an active part of them, but around the time when he was moving to North America and establishing himself would have been right around the time when in North America the movement would have been exported, right? Um, and so that's actually a really interesting point of like living through that particular time and space and ideal in such a concentrated way. I don't know if concentrated is the right word, but like, do you know what I mean in this case? Yeah. Anyway, cool. I like that idea.
I think that
But yeah,
with the
if
phrase is life imitates art and art imitates life, and I think that's entirely true.
yeah,
Because we see things and like we are just a collection of the stories we tell each other and the story and
mhm,
then that then means that we want to recreate those stories in real life. Like that's all it
yeah,
is.
yeah, absolutely. If people are interested, by the way, in knowing more about Grove as a person, I would highly recommend readers to look into his life writing. We'll put it that way. In Search of Myself, it's really interesting
Yeah.
as a piece of like fiction and auto fiction. Um, but also all the work that was done around him by scholars in Canadian literature, dismantling that book is also really interesting. It says a lot about
Sure.
that time. Yeah.
We
Um,
love that time.
sure. In some ways. Um, okay. Now, the other author that we wanted to talk about today is Martha Ostenso. Ostenso is also really interesting, even though she's not as well known today,
Mm.
but she kind of follows a similar trajectory as Grove and a lot of people. Eastern European, right? She would have been born in Norway. Well, Scandinavian, sorry, not
Norway?
Eastern Europe. Yeah,
Wait,
not Eastern Europe.
Norway?
Yeah.
No way.
Hey, oh, got him. Let's go.
Got the
Pow, pow, pow,
joke
pow, pow,
in,
pow.
folks. Bow, bow,
End of episode,
bow,
folks. Thank you very much.
bow.
Goodbye.
Slam dunk. You allied, I ooped it.
Hey, but she would have arrived in Canada a little bit before Grove, or at least in North America, and she moved around a lot. She's less she could be less firmly considered to be a Canadian novelist, unlike Grove, who spent his most of his life and literary output in Canada. Whereas Ostenso very much moved around. The only reason that we consider her novel Wild Geese to be a Canadian novel is because not only was it published in Canada, but it was very much inspired by her brief moment in Manitoba, right? Even though she would spend most of her life afterwards in the United States with her husband.
Mhm.
So she's also influenced in her literary output, like I said, by her experiences in Manitoba, where she moved with her family when she was very young. She attended all the way to the University of Manitoba there, and that's during that period of education where she really became interested in writing. And much like Grove, and again, a lot of immigrants, had similar experiences, especially well-educated ones like Grove and Ostenso would be. She would teach for some time, right? That's pretty much a standard thing. You either are a farm laborer or a teacher, right? Because that's what they needed in the West of the 1910s and 20s. Um, and really, that teaching experience is what would be the background for Wild Geese, which, you know, getting ahead of myself a little bit, is about a teacher who arrives in a small town and um, houses with a weird family. We'll put it
Mhm.
that way. Um, and she would later actually go on to be a reporter. Now,
Hmm.
what's interesting also is that she would later meet her husband, Douglas Durkin, who was also a Canadian author in
10
New
out of 10
York.
name, by the way. I love it. I love the alliteration. I love the sounds. I love Durkin. Very like it's a
It sounds
hard
like,
sound without being like too threatening. Douglas
yeah,
Durkin.
you can
How do
understand
you
why she
do,
fell in
ma'am?
love with him.
My name is Douglas Durkin. Oh, dearie me, I'm Martha Ostenso.
In the Weird Al Yankovic parody, he would be Douglas Gherkin. Thank you very much. I'll see myself out.
He showed everybody his Douglas Gherkin.
Thank you. Great. So she met Durkin in
Against
New
the
York.
ladies of Perkin.
She would actually attend his course
The
because he
people
was a
be a Turkin
well-established.
about it. Sorry.
God damn it.
You'll have to come at me with a Merkin.
Thank you. So she would follow his course in New York because he was actually already an established novelist by then. So she would get a lot of her ideas on how to construct a novel from a professional, which, all credit to Grove was not necessarily that. Right? His novelistic inspirations were much more like, it seems, on the whim. We'll put it that way, rather than like classically trained. Which is not to say he's bad, but different. Funny enough, like they would actually build a relationship and get married. It's now believed that they co-wrote a lot of the books that Ostenso had her name on, right? Although the reason why it was published under her name, right, is to get things like first novel prizes, and eventually her name became, well, or at least at the time, became better known than his, and so that's why they used her name, right? Even though they probably co-wrote a lot of the novels, right? It's kind of subject to literary history and literary interpretation here, but apparently Wild Geese is the one that's most hers, which is kind of
good for
cool.
her.
Yeah, but yeah, most of her output is assumed to be co-written.
Hey, you know what? That's probably most novels.
Yeah, like ghostwriting is still a thing, and co-writing is definitely still a thing. That's fine. It's not a slam against her at all. Like it's just a
I just
fact.
don't want people to think we're slamming people. We love authors here. We stand almost all authors.
Thank you for the clarification there. But yeah, she would actually together they would actually move to the U.S. A little bit later, to Minnesota, specifically about 5 years after the publication of Wild Geese, and they would live for the rest of their lives in the U.S. Right? So, kind of Canadian author-ish. Right? Okay. Shall we take a quick break before we move on to the novels themselves?
And we're back. Returning to you now, Patrick.
Okay, so for the second half, let's talk actually about the novels themselves. There's some few themes that I kind of parsed out here and there that we can talk about, but which one do you want to address first? Like, do you want to address Wild Geese, Settlers of the Marsh? What do you want to go with?
Let's talk about the geese.
Okay. All right. The undoubtedly better of the two novels.
Start high, end on a low. That's my life, baby. Peaking in high school. No, just kidding. High school is horrible for me.
The constant downhill series of
well, let's just say I was like a wild goose, just going between spring and autumn.
So, as we mentioned earlier, Wild Geese is basically follows.
And as I just mentioned now.
Yeah, exactly. Follows Lind Archer. She's the technically main character, although I would argue that other characters are just as important. It's hard to pinpoint a particular main character, but she's the follow along or ride along character, if you will, who's a teacher who arrives in Manitoba and boards with the Gare family, right? And what basically is the central problem of this novel is that Caleb Gare, the patriarch of the family, sucks ass. He's a terrible
patriarchs.
Person. Yep.
Fucking patriarchy.
1920s patriarchs. The greats.
1920s patriarchs coming at you live with their belts.
he's abusive, he's controlling, he's an all-around dick.
Just the
And
bad guy.
basically the whole novel is how his family tries to escape from him in different ways, right? His wife tries to find independence. His daughter Judith tries to sexually liberate herself, right? Through a variety um, of either explicit or implicit actions, right? Um, Lind is going about it as a teacher through more educated and often ideological conflict between her and Caleb, right? And it all kind of unravels throughout the novel. But what's kind of interesting, and we'll see this in a lot of realist novels, but in Settlers of the Marsh as well, right? As with Wild Geese, is that Caleb's own central conflict is, of course, his control over his family, but that is also paralleled in his desire to absolutely control and dominate the Manitoba land, right? Um, and which says a lot about him as a character and as a settler colonial figure, right? Um, but yeah, just there's that parallel here between humans and family as well as farming and land, which is kind of interesting throughout the novel to explore. Um, but yeah, I really like this novel. I don't know about you, but I think
Shocker, the
this is
literature nerd likes the novel. No,
well,
I'm kidding. I
okay.
actually really liked it. I actually really enjoyed the excerpt that I read and the parts of this that I read. I think there's a
Mhm.
very the turn realism. I'm like you in that realism isn't exactly my cup of tea. I think we're both more we enjoy when things get a little kooky,
Mhm.
but the turn of phrase here is just so good, and the
Yeah.
actual written prose is so well handled.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Just to give, might as well give some excerpts to the audience in this one.
Judith's
Yeah, you
head
can
was
mind it.
high, her eyes half closed. The buggy rumbled down the hollow over a little bridge that led through a dense growth of spruce and cedar. Sven drew her suddenly into his arms, letting the reins fall slack over his knees. Damn, you're beautiful, Judy. Judith smiled. Her body softened toward him. It rippled with strength. She was peculiarly aware of her strength. It seemed to flow upward from her spine in a powerful current and issue from her breast and her fingertips and all the sensitive surface of her body. A strange desire seized her. She could not free herself from the obsession. It had come upon her the first day she had seen Sven after his return. I wonder if I can throw you, she said suddenly. Sven laughed aloud. I'll bet I can, she asserted. Let me try. All right, sometime, he agreed, laughing still. No, right now, Judith insisted, her eyes roving over the muscles that moved under his shirt sleeve. It was warm and neither wore a coat. Sven glanced at her and saw that she was in earnest. They got down from the buggy, tying the horse to a tree at the side of the road. Then they crawled through the fence into a little clearing among the cedars where the sunlight lay in a warm pool on the ground. Kiss me first, said Sven. No, after, Judith said steadily. I'm going to call it there just because it's a you get the idea from here, and I think that's enough to talk about some of the really interesting ways she uses prose to discuss themes and to sort of impart relationship dynamics.
Yeah.
Because as this excerpt continues and the scene continues, we see a lot of Sven continue to laugh while she very seriously takes this wrestling very seriously, and then he is forced to take it seriously. He stops laughing, and the two of them are just fighting each other in a very natural, primal way. And it's a really interesting discussion of how we talked about the beginning of romanticism and realism living together, because they are out in nature, and there is very much a sexual tension to
Oh yeah.
this,
Oh yeah.
but it still has a very realistic take on it. It ends in a very almost sobering way with Judith real learning that her perceived strength is not enough. She could still, if Sven wanted to, he could take her without her permission and her power. And
That's
Sven's
not
also
that's not where
hmm?
her power lies. Yeah.
No.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so like physically she does, and it's really like like not beautiful, but it's really just well written, and you get it, and they don't have to say it, but you get it very quickly.
Which is hard to do as a novel. Like the idea of showing, not telling, right, is very
Mm-hmm.
hard to convey in a like fundamentally written medium, right?
Yes.
So, and I think this is a good example of an author accomplishing just that, right? She
He just
is
gets it.
advancing the story without explicitly telling you what the characters are thinking or saying or
Doing,
meaning.
behaving.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which, again, mark of a great author right there. Right. You did say something interesting there when you were saying that there are elements of romanticism and realism in that excerpt, and this is true throughout the novel, by the way. Um, it it could almost go into the melodrama, right? Which some realism does more than others, but you can imagine like when she's describing like, oh, his bare chest and the rippling muscles and all of that, like it could almost be melodramatic and saccharine, right? Like the unfortunate romantic, right? Not the romanticism in the literary sense, but like the notebook style romantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't. And that's what makes the scene beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's controlled and it's actually deliberate, right? It's not unbridled in its sexuality. And that was what I think makes its strength in this particular
Mm-hmm.
case, right? That's what makes it realistic, right? Because even if it's not an actual situation, it's what makes it realistic because that's how human beings would actually operate, right? They don't usually operate in the over exaggerated, hyper romantic, and sexualized way that people kind of portray sometimes in movies. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if this makes sense or if this just is just the ramblings of a madman, but yes, I agree, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
Um,
Uh,
but that's kind of cool because what's interesting is that they're focusing in this passage on Sven's body and in the passage that you read, right, on Sven's body, his muscles and all of that. Can she lift him? But
yeah.
Judith, who's the woman in this scene, um, is often in her actions and body described in very animalistic terms, which
Mm-hmm.
almost leads it into like fantasy, right? Because she's very much described in through like horse imagery. I think at some point in the novel she's called a unicorn, if I remember correctly. It's
I'm a
really interesting.
unicorn.
Yeah, and like all kinds of mythical creatures and very much having that like ecological woman type of vibe to her. And I think it's interesting how Ostenso chooses particular words to describe people's bodies in those ways,
Yeah.
right?
Well, even just the way she describes like that bit about how Judith's strength rolled up through her body
Yeah,
into her fingertips, her breast, the sensitive areas up through her spine. That's a very like it almost makes you like you feel it in your own body at the same time. Like I almost like I rolled my shoulders when I read that, you know? Just sort of
yeah,
give you that sort of like, oh,
yeah.
you suddenly become
Yeah.
aware of your own strength and your own power in your body and where that
It's
comes
like
from.
a power that's like beyond human in a sense,
Hmm.
right? Yeah, for sure.
It's very
Um,
primal.
yeah. Um, but that's obviously a major theme of the novel is sexuality, right?
Oh, 100%.
It's and I don't know because again, like you said, I'm not a huge fan of realism in and of itself, like as a movement. So I haven't read so much that I could say this with any certainty. Do you feel like sexuality is a common theme in a lot of realistic novels as a movement? Because I know it is in Settlers. That's why I bring it up. But
Oh boy. It
would you? Hmm, I would say that like
I'd
it
say
depends.
yes. I yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, I've definitely read enough novels that I'd say it becomes that way insofar that anytime you involve a female character, a discussion of sexuality almost becomes necessary. And it's
Yeah,
also it's not even necessarily it depends where you draw the line of sexuality, romance, femininity, womanhood, because if you take the most like one of the biggest examples to my mind, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. not an explicitly sexual book at all, really. But there's still a constant undertone and discussion about with it between the women and the other and their connected relationship with the male characters. Their sexuality is what they have to offer.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that relates back to realism, and that's realistically speaking, at that time, that is what most women had to offer, and it was their chief weapon, as it were.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's so much it can be a recurring motif, if not a theme, simply because it's something that has or had to be discussed at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these two novels were rather controversial for their approach to sexuality at the time.
Oh, for
Like
sure.
Canadian morals were not ready for like the explicit ways in which
Oh, well, that excerpt,
the
man. Damn.
but not just that, like straight I have one here, 215. So at the to bring back this general idea, which is why I think in Ostenso at least it's a theme. I think I agree in that in Settlers it might be more of a motif, the sexuality part.
Mm.
Um, but I think Wild Geese is a theme because Caleb, Judith's father, is such a sexually repressed character, right, throughout the
Mm-hmm.
entire novel, right? It just that's what drives most of his anger, right? He just goes mad from the fact that his wife has an affair
Yeah.
with another man. And the passage that I'm about to read is when he finds his daughter Judith with Sven just having a literal roll in the hay in this case. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he he just bursts, right? He goes, "What are you up to out there in the bush, eh? With that Sambo dog, a bitch like your mother, eh? Come here and I'll show you it pays to be decent." And he took another step towards her. Judith's hand swept down and grasped the handle of the axe, right? There's a moment when it literally comes to violence just because of the very fact that he sees his daughter doing like literally the most natural thing of having an intimate
Mm-hmm.
relationship with someone else, right? On her own terms, by the way, which again,
Chicka bow
rather
wow.
rare for 1920s. um,
Mm.
but so it's really I think in this case it absolutely is a theme for this book. Um, but yeah, there's the sexually repressed part as well, and this kind of relates back to land.
Mm-hmm.
There's some moments when Caleb in Wild Geese strokes the wheat field um that he's taking care of, right? And as one of my professors mentioned when we were talking about that novel, it's so phallic, right? Because wheat is obviously like, at least as far as imagery is concerned, like can be rather
Mm-hmm.
phallic. And Caleb's stroking of it, and that's the only moment when he's like calm, right? And actually a normal human, right? Is can probably be the subject of a whole psychoanalytic, examination of Caleb's character as a sexually repressed gay dude. And it's really, really interesting. Yeah. Obviously, Ostenso was not thinking about that in those terms, I don't think, but
No.
it's still
Well, I
interesting to think
think,
about like that section. Yeah.
and I think we have to note that often authors won't think of exactly what themes they want to
Mhm.
be writing about. They will simply come into existence.
Yeah.
After the fact, the readers will take away what they want. Like that's what makes art is that there's a conversation between the two. It doesn't matter
Yes.
that Herman Melville says, "Don't read anything deeper into my works. There's nothing actually deep there." People are gonna find what they want to find. Go fuck yourself.
Yeah. No, there's only one correct interpretation of a novel is what the author intended. I don't think
Like
that was caught up on.
unless the
Yeah.
the work is very blatant. Like some works are so blatant, like
Yeah.
yeah, everybody's gonna come away with the same
Yeah.
idea, or
Exactly.
they're so basic, like your average moral and fable for sure. But like in these
Yeah.
more complex novels, like I'm not gonna
Like a
say that.
YA.
Yeah, I'm not gonna say something like Birth of a Nation isn't just the one horribly racist thing it is.
Well,
It
I
just
do.
is the horribly racist thing.
But yeah, I don't know. Did you have anything else to say about the sexualized part? Because I also wanted to talk about the land
That's
nature
very much
part
a
as well.
holdover from romanticism, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's the big crossover between the two. Is romanticism was, oh boy, did people like to talk about sex, which is good. It's a very natural thing to happen. It's just part of the body. And
Tell
I
me about
think
sex without telling me about sex. Scribbles down romantic poem.
scribbles, yes. But and we have to remember, at the time, sex was still a major taboo.
Yes.
We
Yep.
did not have the sexual revolution yet. So
Yeah.
that simply just wasn't a thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And do we want to talk about sexuality in relation to settlers first, or finish our discussion on wild geese and then go on to settlers?
I think we should move on to settlers and then we can come back to
And then
sexuality.
come back. Okay. But I mean, the sexuality part is in relation to settlers as well. Like, Settlers itself as a novel is much more straightforward. It's a guy and his friend who his brother, sorry, who come to a small town in Manitoba, starting to see a trend here. And in this case, their main problem in the novel is actually setting up a homestead, right? They've been hired as homesteaders and they need to establish a settlement.
Have I told you about my idea about Canadian literature in relation to other types of literature?
No. Do you have a
So
candidate theory?
I don't really know if it counts as a theory, and I don't even know if I'm probably not the first person to say this, but you've seen those memes of American literature is the suffering ones or whatever, suffering through love. So British literature is suffering through love, Russian literature is just suffering. American literature is suffering through war or suffering for glory.
Yeah.
Why do we suffer? And to me, Canadian literature is suffering for movement. To me, Canadian
That's
literature, the
really
most
good.
common recurring theme and motif in Canadian literature is just the very act of movement itself.
That's really good.
Settling, moving into the west. Even if you take something like the Geese one, they literally were just moving, and that's what caused all the problems on the buggy. In the big city, the movement from district to district, borough to borough. Canadian, if you're gonna boil down Canadian literature to one general motif, it's just movement.
Yeah. And literally the first page of Settlers of the Marsh indicates that, right? At the bottom of the page, in the notes it's written as page 11, but at the bottom of the page, right, above 5 miles from town, they reached on the North Road the point where the continuous settlement ran out into the wild sandy land, which, forming the margin of the Big Marsh, intervened between the territory of the towns and the next Russer-German settlement to north, some 20 miles or so straight ahead. So this emphasis on distance and going constantly forward, but also that seeming contradiction of continuous settlement. That's how you're going to open your novel, right? In relation, it's really, I think you really hit the nail on the head on that one. I don't know.
Yeah, I just think Canadian literature to me is very we suffer to move. We just want to, and that's why we have so many famous immigrant authors.
Yeah.
And we're building so many authors who are just, I don't know. That's been my personal theory.
I think there's an article in there somewhere.
Oh God, don't even get me started. I've got too many articles in my head and not enough willpower to write them. I could have been an academic. I got accepted for it at all the other big universities.
Yeah.
But I wanted financial stability, so I became a teacher.
You fucking loser.
Capitalism, baby, it wins out every time.
So to come back briefly to the sexualized theme, so what's kind of interesting is that despite the fact that in his European days, Grove would have wrote a novel that was very controversial, right? This was a novel in German, and I'm not going to try to say the name because I don't care. But see, the entire novel is very sexually charged, that original German one. And the public kind of rejected him for it. And so it's interesting that in this particular novel, one of the first that he writes in Canada, he takes a much more moralistic stance towards sexuality, right? And I feel like that's very interesting
Moralistic.
and says a lot. Yeah, it says a lot about how people move or change their opinions when moving from
Move,
one country to
sex,
another. I'm sorry.
movement, sex,
Yeah,
often
I mean,
violent,
yeah,
chaotic,
movement,
but
sex.
leads to the new birth.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
The
I think you
One
can
could say
absolutely make
the
that claim.
birth of a nation parallels.
Please no. Oh God, no.
I'm kidding.
Grove would have actually.
On the road
What's
leading
fun?
north from the little prairie town Minor, two men were fighting their way through the gathering dusk. Both were recent immigrants. One, Lars Nelson, a giant of 30 years standing in the country. The other, Niels Lindstedt, slightly above the medium size, but compactly built, of only 3 months. Both were Swedes, and they had struck up a friendship, which had led to a partnership for the winter that was coming. They had been working on a threshing gang between Minor and Balfour, and were now on their way to the bush settlement to the northeast where scattered homesteads reached out into the wilderness. It was the beginning of the month of November. Niels carried his suitcase on his back, Nelson his new friend's bundle, which also held the few belongings of his own which he had along. He wore practically the same clothes winter and summer. About 5 miles from town they reached on the north road, the point where the continuous settlement ran out into the wild. Sandy land which, forming the margin of the big marsh, intervened between the territory of the towns and the next Russo-German settlement to the north, some 20 miles or so straight ahead. At this point, the road left the muddy river and passed through its sheltering fringe of bush to strike out over a sheer waste of heath-like country covered with low, creeping bush. The wind, which had been soughing through the treetops, had free swamp here. An exceedingly fine dust of dry, powdery ice crystals began to fly. You could call it snow so far. It did not occur to Niels to utter or even harbor apprehensions. His powerful companion knew the road. Where he went, Niels would go. They swung on, for the most part, in silence. So I just kind of jumped in to get myself back on track onto that excerpt, but I thought it was also a very powerful excerpt to talk about in relation to this movement claiming of the land, the fact that they're in Canada, but they're Swedish going to a Russo-German town, like this constant clashing of cultures.
It's like on the cusp
And
of multiculturalism.
but also it's the
Yeah,
isolationism of it too. And again, that idea that as a country we seem to be moving so much, but never towards each other.
yeah, yeah. That's one of the notes I wrote down. Is like it's kind of fascinating how both novels again are just so concerned with community, and yet feature such isolated character. Like all of the characters, their goal is to be less isolated. It seems written both
Hmm.
novels. Not all of the characters, but like most of the characters seem to be struggling with a sense of being alone, and yet everything around them should indicate community, right, in some way, shape, or form. And that contradiction is really interesting. Um,
I think that's a very big part of realism.
mhm, mhm.
It's
In the
how do I
modern
put
world,
this?
yeah, yeah,
Or realism, modernism, etc. In
yeah,
that, because yes, we did like obviously we weren't at the stage of social media, but all technology was exploding, and that very much included communication technology, telephones, telegrams. Postal services were getting faster with the creation of trains. The creation of cars was starting to become a thing, and so people got their mail and such more quickly. They got their news more quickly. The multi-printing of the newspaper. And so,
yeah.
yes, people definitely were still living in their small communities, but we're you the more access we have to the world, the more we isolate ourselves personally,
Yes,
I think.
yeah.
And so I think that's
Which
kind of the point that we're seeing right now.
exactly. Yeah. And in this case, access to the world is literally these multicultural figures. Multicultural in like the
Mhm.
classic sense of like many cultures as one. Like you're leaving out towards this new frontier, this thing that should not exist in the way that it does in the minds of most people. And you're meeting people from all kinds of countries that you would never have met. And you're supposed to create this new country. And it's like, what is what is even being an individual in this particular sense? It's really interesting to think about. There are not questions that I think Grove answers
I
in
mean,
this particular
individuality
novel.
is also just a lie anyway, so
Well, yeah, sure.
individuality is a
In some ways,
construct.
it's all a construct. All of it. We're living in the Matrix.
No, it's just I don't know. Like none of us are actually
I
that individual. We're coming from families who come from
yeah,
cultures, who come from stories and shapes. And every time we try and say we try and assert ourselves, that usually means that we're buying and making things that will then be recreated and posted about and turned into other things.
yeah.
Like
No,
you're not an
I
individual.
agree.
Get over it. Who cares?
Yeah,
And I
we
think
kind of
that's
got
the large
sidetracked.
problem is that this modernism realism is when
Mhm.
people that finally started to click into place.
Yeah,
We all got so
yeah,
connected that we all finally realized we aren't special.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I think
Yeah.
it's a really important lesson to learn because you also learn if you keep going, it doesn't matter that you're not special. The act of not being special does in fact make you special. Or let me put it this way. You are not divinely made to be special. You
Mhm.
choose to be special for yourself.
Absolutely. And I think, by the way, the Grove
Only the
text.
fucking Buddha. I
No, but
am
like
the
Grove,
enlightened one.
Grove
Sorry.
as a reader, I think would, as a writer, would very much push towards these tendencies of getting to think about something wider than yourself, right?
Hmm.
Although he would push it more in like a universalizing tendency, which is a bit problematic in and of itself. But I think those elements are definitely at the back of his mind. Um,
Yeah, no, for well, I mean, there's the recurring phrase, I am I.
yes, yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm sure you'll have your own understanding of this, but for me, the phrase I am I basically like it quite literally in a very literal sense is I am me.
Hmm.
I am simple like in its most simple terms, this is who I am.
But
I'm not
it
you, I'm
also
not
it also emphasizes the subjectivity of it. I instead of
yes.
I am me, which would emphasize the object, right?
Yes, that's right.
Mhm, mhm.
That's
So
true. The
it
use of the I is like this is how I see me.
exactly, yeah, yeah.
Dark side is I am I.
But we have like 10 minutes left on our Zoom call. So final thoughts here on each of them because I ain't restarting the Zoom call again. Um, I think what I want to finish off on like the moralistic elements just a little bit because I think both of them indicate a message in a very interesting way. Both novels, I mean. So
Well, and that was again a big push in realism because
yeah,
romanticism was all about just living in the moment. Who cares about society? Realism really tries to assert that we need to give ourselves morals, or else we'll get things like World War One again.
right,
So,
exactly, exactly. And so Grove is really interesting, and that's where the sexuality part comes in, where it's like the novel, the latter part of the novel is that the main character Niles kills his lover, right, because he has an affair with a woman. He kills his lover when he's enraged by the fact that she turns his home into a brothel, um, which is
mm.
weird. Admittedly a weird thing, but you see the moralistic element that I was talking about, right? Where Grove is like, okay, well, this person or this lover has too much sexualized or sexual based freedom. Even if she doesn't participate in the brothel explicitly, she's the one running it. And so
Bam, chicka bum bum.
she dies.
Hmm.
Right? Like that's that. So there's a rather conservative moralistic element to it, right? Which
Hmm.
is a bit weird considering that Grove in his personal life was in many ways surprisingly progressive. In some ways, not always, but in many ways surprisingly progressive. Um, and I think that Wild Geese's moral is sick
What's Wild
because
Geese's moral? Tell it. Lay it down on me.
Caleb Gare, the asshole, literally gets swallowed by the land that he mistreats. that
That is
the
fire as hell, and you know what? That is romanticism as hell.
I know, right? Like literally,
Like.
hold on, let me find it. Let me find it. It's great.
But that's
Um,
such good imagery. Oh my
yeah, there you
God.
go.
Especially
The
since he
earth,
was
Yeah, there you go. The earth seemed to billow like water, but Caleb paid no heed. He clung to the lantern and rushed on, his head leaning far forward, his shoulders high. Then suddenly something seemed to be tugging at his feet. He could not release them. Water was oozing into his shoes and pushing up his ankles. He was close to the timber now, so that he could feel the gusty heat from the fire, but the water about his legs was colder than ice. He bent down and pulled at the reeds in an effort to jerk his feet free, but the strength of the earth was irresistible. His arms were those of a feeble puppet fanning at the air. He stood upright again and strained with all his might, but the insidious force of the earth drew him in deeper.
So
And it just keeps
we
going.
only have like 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna do this as quick as I can. But that is such a perfect tie back to the themes of sexuality before. Due to the you're pumping the air because yes, you're right, we are both right. That is such wonderful fucking tiebacks in prose. And people are wondering why that is. And that's because sexuality is often tied to the earth and the fact that Mother Nature is often portrayed as womanly, and then man rapes the earth, especially at the time of the realism because of the Industrial Revolution and all the mining. Yes, I'm speaking very fast, I know. But in the Industrial Revolution, is all based around the mining, the plundering, the raping of the earth for its resources, its minerals, and all its life-bearing things. So to have Mother Earth quite physically push back against her abuser and fucking absorb him into the earth is such a bomb-ass symbolic representation, and I love that so much. I'm gonna go buy this book now. So
it is a mic drop.
It really ties into it also really ties into how sexuality plays into realism insofar that it's in the background more than anything else. Without being explicitly sexual, things will be primal. And primalness is sexuality because at a primal level, we all have the urge for food, fighting, and fucking. So there you go in life. And that's a very realistic way to look at the world. That is so beautiful. I love that so much. So take us away, Patrick, because I don't think we can end on a higher note than that. And I'm out of breath.
Yes. I was actually not expecting to have this much excitement about this episode, but cool. If you want to support the show, you can check us out on Patreon. But otherwise, just leaving a review, telling your friends about the show or anything like that, reaching out with an email telling us what you'd like us to cover in the future is awesome stuff. We will probably be doing an episode next week about a famous poetry group called the Montreal Group, which features one of my favorite poets. He's really cool.
Oh no, not the Montreal.
He's cool. Do you really?
What time frame is this again? Sorry, like wait, what's the time frame?
20s, 30s.
Okay, we're fine then. God.
Oh, yeah. No.
I thought we were talking like 50s, 60s Montreal poetry.
No, not yet.
Oh,
no,
thank
not
God.
yet.
What is that? The beat poets?
Close, but yeah, you're like Raymond Susters and all of that. Yeah, no, not yet.
No, 20s, 30s is fine.
Yeah. And yeah, so we're probably going to talk about that, and eventually, soon, I think we're going to be talking about William Lyon Mackenzie King. And so those are what we're planning as episodes.
Go next in the Prime Minister debate list.
Let's go.
Will anyone top John A. MacDonald? Not this guy, that's for sure. Listen, in the grand scheme of things, there's only two guys that will ever have a chance of topping MacDonald now that we've passed Laurier. There's King, and then there is our big daddy, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Gotta love him. It's anyway. Trudeau with the steel chair.
So, thank you everyone for listening to us and our insanities, and we'll catch you on another episode.
Quick ending, but it's just that's the time we live in.
Yep.
Yay.
Oh, we'll find an alternative for cutting every 40 minutes. Yeah. Anyway, cheers, everyone.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcast FREE.